The Leader of the National Party.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Acting Speaker. I rise to contribute to what the Treasurer just said, Appropriation Recurrent Bill 2017 and Appropriation Capital 2017-18 Bill as just read in by the Treasurer. Mr Acting Speaker, what an absolute con job we've heard in this House this afternoon in relation to the budget that the Labor Party has brought down. They've all drunk the Kool-Aid. They've drunk the Kool-Aid, haven't they? They've read those talking points that have been circulated to all and sundry, and they actually believe them. They actually believe that this is a good budget. They do. They're convinced. They're so urgent. They're so earnest and urgent. And there was a question. There was a question as to whether or not we would be responsible. Well, as the National Party in relation to this budget, Mr Acting Speaker, and I can tell you that we have always taken our role seriously in this parliament. The Nationals have always taken their role seriously. And what I can tell you, Mr Acting Speaker, is that the delivery of this first budget by the McGowan Labor government was accompanied with a sense of inevitability and deep gloom in regional Western Australia. Deep gloom. So although the members opposite constantly crow that they have the most regional members, I can tell you when we go to their seats, when we go to their electorates, they are on the nose. They are on the nose. So they've drunk the Kool-Aid because nobody in regional Western Australia, and indeed I think it stretches further than that, believes this is a good budget. We had, as the Nationals and our constituents, braced ourselves prior to budget day. We knew that it would be bad. We knew that Labor did not like royalties for regions. And from election day to budget day, there were many signs coming out of the government that royalties for regions was on the chopping block. And we were very clear with the electorate beforehand that that was what was going to happen. They were going to raid royalties for regions to meet their own election commitments. And we understood very clearly that the intent of the incoming government was to demonise and demolish royalties for regions. And that's exactly what they've done. So over the course of the last 6 months, we've seen cuts to programs, information being dribbled out to community groups and shires and all sorts of other organisations that have already had those commitments from the previous government, that they were ready to go. And I heard one very distressed member of the public this morning calling in relation to an aged care project, trying to understand why their aged care project had been cut off the list, and yet there was some discussion around a $7 million swimming pool for a community that did not want it. And this is in a seat where the Labor Party has held the seat for the last 5 years. So don't be crying that you didn't know and you only had a short period of time to come up with the budget, because the Labor Party should very well have known that in that particular case, that community did not want that project. We knew that that royalties for regions was to be cut, because how could they let it survive as a constant reminder that regional Western Australia has been put on the back burner for the next 4 years? They couldn't have royalties for regions in any meaningful way in their budget as a constant daily reminder that when we were in government, the Liberal National Government put regional Western Australians first. And so demolish, demonise, substitute, shunt things in that were never designed to be paid for by royalties for regions to wash out the value that has been delivered to this state by that program. That is what this budget means to regional Western Australia. And the regional MPs that stood and applauded when this budget was handed down last week, they should hang their heads in shame. And I would really be interested to see how their constituents are responding in their electorates. You should hang your heads in shame, because there is nothing in this budget. There is nothing in this budget, member for Pilbara. Didn't stand up when you had the chance to talk about state agreements, made no contributions in this House in relation to what's happening in your electorate. You should hang your head in shame. Don't you understand that the focus of this government is on Perth? There are more members from the Labor Party, from the metropolitan area in that party than there are regional, and that's just the way it goes. That's why you see the Minister for Transport stand up every 5 minutes and talk about Metronet, and that's why you'll get a few lollies along the way, but you won't actually see what happened under the last Liberal National Government for the last 8 years. You won't see those transformational projects. And it doesn't matter how good you reckon you are, you're not going to win them because it's about the numbers and you don't have enough. You don't have enough. But you could at least stand up. You could at least stand up and have a go. You could at least stand up and have a go because you were all elected regional members of the Labor Party. You were all elected on a promise to keep royalties for regions. Every single one of you promised your constituents. And I don't think that there is any one of you that is prepared to stand up and concede that you came to the role under false pretence. That's what your electorates believe. That's what they're telling us. And unless you're living under a rock, at every country Labor MP will be getting the same feedback that we're getting as we travel around the state. If you voted for Labor, you feel betrayed, Mr Acting Speaker. They feel deceived, and they feel cheated. Mr Speaker, I want to talk about the fact that when you have Mr Acting Speaker, every budget comes down to a choice, and this is what we're debating today. This budget has very clearly articulated that the Labor Party has, and the McGowan Labor government has articulated their priorities. We had to wait almost 6 months, but the priorities of the Labor government are abundantly clear. And we're going to mark down the 2017-18 state budget as the point in time when the Premier and the Treasurer made a choice. They made a choice to abandon regional Western Australia by raiding royalties for regions, and they made a choice to break their own election commitments and promises on no new taxes, by increasing payroll tax, the most insidious of taxes, a tax on jobs. They made a choice to break their word to the gold sector. This from a government who have fallen over themselves since coming to government to be shoulder to shoulder with the iron ore sector and the two big miners. Turns out when they actually wanted to be friends, it meant with the mining sector, it meant that they only wanted to be friends with the guys with the deep pockets. They made a choice to break their word to the gold sector. They made a choice to break their word to the police, the men and women that put their lives on the line for us. They've made a choice to sack 3,000 public sector servants. Those are the choices that the Labor Party has made. The Treasurer, the Premier, his Cabinet. And Mr Acting Speaker, I think they are the wrong choices. The National Party believes they are the wrong choices. And I'll tell you what, the community absolutely thinks that they are the wrong choices. It will not drive jobs, it will not drive growth, it will not drive prosperity, and that is what they were elected on a promise of, and they have broken them all. And those choices spell misery and pain for everyone in this state that can least afford it. And the Nationals want to know why the Labor Party, the Premier and the Treasurer are happy to break these promises to the gold sector, to the public service, to the WA Police, to the business community, not just the two big miners, to the business community, 1,300 businesses who are significant employers in this state, with a tax that is a tax on jobs. It's insidious. It's insidious. Every government, every opposition has argued that there should be a decrease in payroll tax. Every industry group has argued that there should be a decrease in payroll tax. This government came to power on the back of, we will not increase taxes. Broken promises, broken promises. Why has Labor made these choices when there are clear alternatives? So the Treasurer has handed down a budget that we think, if he'd been sitting on this side of the chamber, Mr Acting Speaker, that he would have taken great joy in ripping apart, absolutely ripping apart. It's the kind of budget that he railed against while he was sitting on this side of the House. It's a budget that not only breaks promises, it fails to deliver any substantial change in the bottom line. We've got a bigger deficit next year, we've got a bigger deficit the year after, we've got a bigger deficit the year after that. Debt is still headed past $43 billion. So all this pain and no gain. No gain. And we still don't have the full picture because, as their own former Treasurer and leader has said, quoted in the media last week in the West Australian, Eric Ripper, page 4 of the West Australian, funds for some big health and metro projects are not in the budget and therefore ultimate state debt may have been underestimated. This is from one of their own. And yet, Mr Acting Speaker, the government made $5 billion worth of election commitments. $5 billion. Already blown out, we are told, and we can ascertain from some of the reporting, to $6 billion. So I can accept, and the Nationals can accept, the argument that we all need to tighten our belts. We understand that. Everyone in Western Australia understands the perversity of the GST, and how it works, and the headwinds that has caused, and the financial difficulties that governments of both persuasions have faced. We all understand the fluctuating nature of the iron ore price and the sector, and the way that it essentially writes down enormous amounts of revenue for the state. But in this context, when that's all they spoke about for the last 8 years, do you come to government with $5 billion worth of election commitments? I don't think you do. But if you're the Labor Party, you do. You promise the world, then you plead forgiveness and apologise when you break those promises not less than 6 months later. But you only break the promises in relation to revenue, and then only to some sections of the community and the business sector. There is no restraint from Labor when it comes to reeling in its election commitments. No, they're going to keep on delivering those $5 billion worth of election promises. Couldn't possibly break those promises, Mr Acting Speaker. I would draw the House's attention to the fact that the Treasurer, who has just so smoothly explained why we should all be coming together to help solve this problem, he had a favourite saying when he occupied this side of the House, and for some of the members opposite they may not have heard it, but we certainly did on many occasions. And I'm going to paraphrase because it was in various different formats, but governments should always deal with the fiscal realities in front of them. Yet when the Treasurer finally got his chance to hold the purse strings, he has pled ignorance and then asked for forgiveness. And neither he or the government, he says, can be blamed. We can't be blamed, and we're sorry. We're sorry. And when you make an apology, Mr Acting Speaker, you actually are then supposed to make amends. But none of that's coming, just the pain and the misery. And the Treasurer is very smooth. Smooth as a gravy sandwich, as my lovely father would say. He's very deft at making it seem like what he's saying is the only way to address some of the challenges the state is facing, that there is no alternative, and he has been forced to introduce these measures. But we know that's not true. We know that's not true. He could have said, we came to government without a financial plan. That's true. Could have apologised for that. We made $5 billion worth of election commitments that we knew we couldn't pay for. That's true. We won by promising not to sell assets or increase taxes or tread on the toes of the iron ore sector. That's also true. He could have said, now's the time to have some tough conversations. Now's the time to have some tough conversations with the iron ore sector. Instead, they penned some talking points for their members and their backbenchers, and they asked them to emphasise that we really are asking the iron ore sector to pay their fair share. We really are. It's okay. Kind of. Not really, Mr Acting Speaker. They increased a job-destroying tax that not only impacts on BHP and Rio Tinto, but 1,300 other businesses that employ hundreds of people, if not thousands of people in this state. And Labor have demonstrated again and again, every turn they get, they'll rather choose somewhere else to go than have that tough conversation with the Labor Party and, with BHP and Rio Tinto. Couldn't even get the government to agree to an inquiry last week, just an inquiry with a government-controlled committee. What is it? What is it about having the discussion about some of these legacy state agreements and a sit-down with the two big miners to talk about how they can contribute to some of the fiscal realities this state is
Apparently it sends
facing?
a bad signal.
Bad signal, but not if you're the gold, not if you're the gold sector or anywhere else. So, Mr Acting Speaker, I want to talk a little bit about broken promises and do a little bit of compare and contrast. I think there'll be some members that remember that maybe from English Lit or some of their university days. And I'd like to read in a quote from the Premier when he was the Leader of the Opposition, as he was making a pitch to be the Premier. And he said, "My vision for Western Australia is of a successful state brimming with opportunities for all our citizens, a fair state where, regardless of income, religion, background or location, people can be whatever they want to be based on their ability, work and need, a state that plans for the long term with decent planning, housing, transport, health and education systems, a state with a diversified economy that rides the ups and downs of the mining and resources sector, a state with a diverse array of robust industries, which is why I launched our plan for jobs and our Metronet plan, and a state with a reasonable, competent, stable and honest state budget." That was Budget Reply 2016. Now, this is in response to the budget that the Premier and the Treasurer have just brought down. And it's a quote from a leading businessman reflecting on the state budget from the 11th of September. It's Mr Beament, who is from Northern Star. He's a gold miner. And this is a quote from the West Australian on the 11th, which is yesterday, day before. Mr Beaumont, who turned Northern Star from a penny dreadful into an ASX 200 powerhouse, said the Labor government's willingness to break a promise should be a huge worry for all West Australians. This isn't just about the gold industry or the resource sector. This matters for all West Australians because we now all know that the Premier's promises aren't worth the paper they are written on. He will just break his promise and say, oh, well, I'm sorry about that. He openly acknowledged that an increase to the gold royalty was pointless and destructive. He sought to get maximum political mileage out of the promise, and once he extracted people's votes, he dumped the commitment. It is now virtually impossible to believe anything he says. And I have pages and pages of promises and commitments in relation to the mining tax, to the payroll tax, to commitments that the Labor Party made in relation to the gold royalty. Not just Mr McGowan, the Premier, Stephen Dawson, Minister for Environment, the member for Collie. There are a whole raft of them. The Treasurer, again and again and again, committing not to increase the gold royalty, and then got to government and said, whoops, sorry about that, made a mistake. It is now virtually impossible to believe anything that he says. And it is going to be incredibly embarrassing for the regional MPs in this place when they go out and try to explain to their communities while they're using royalties for regions to make up the difference. How can you possibly explain the rationale by using royalties for regions to pay for teacher education assistance? How can you possibly explain shifting the entire patient-assisted transport scheme into royalties for regions? How do you explain a multi-storey car park in Mandurah so people can travel to Perth? That's not regional development. This is the problem. This government has no commitment to regional development. How do you explain to go to Perth? To go to Perth. So all of these things, Mr Acting Speaker, all of these things, yeah, you're a bit sensitive about it, aren't you? You're a bit sensitive about it. Made $5 billion worth of shiny election commitments and are committed to those, but will break promises left, right and centre to those that actually create jobs and that actually do the hard yards in this community. There was no mention of a 50% hike in gold royalties during the campaign. There was no mention of scrapping royalty-free threshold for gold producers. There was no announcement on a tax on jobs. May I have an extension, please, Mr Acting Speaker?
Extension grant.
Jobs, not taxes, was the slogan of choice, and Labor joined in, sat beside, watched as the Chamber of Minerals and Energy splurged $4.3 million on slandering the Nationals when we dared to question whether or not the state's two most profitable miners were paying enough for our finite resources. And the Labor Party won the seat of Pilbara off the back of that campaign. Let's not pretend it was anything else. I am sure that the member for Pilbara is a very nice man. I'm paying him a compliment. I'm paying him a compliment. Let's not pretend it was anything else. He's here because the Chamber and BHP and Rio Tinto paid $4.3 billion. In contrast, Mr Acting Speaker,
very noisy backbencher there.
in contrast, Mr Acting Speaker, we travelled the state telling people what we were going to do.
Members.
That we didn't believe that the heavy lifting should be left to mums and dads and to those that couldn't afford it. And we got heavily criticised for a policy that would have generated $7.2 billion. So this is the rub. All of this pain and misery generates $3.5 billion. And it's delivered through an attack on job-creating industry by increasing a tax that no one likes, openly, on both sides of the House for many, many years, have criticised payroll tax. Labor's revenue measures are targeting all the wrong sectors and it generates $3.5 billion. And conveniently, the argument that any new revenue gets distributed away to other states just gets pushed aside when you start talking about the gold royalty. It just doesn't apply. So I've heard almost the exact same arguments that we put to the community in relation to the special lease rental or a discussion around increased charges for the two big mining companies coming straight back at us, despite the fact that they railed against it. They railed against it. And I just cannot figure that one out, Mr Acting Speaker. We spoke about the fact that the Premier has done a number of backflips. In May 2017, so this year, the now Premier told a Chamber of Minerals and Energy WA business luncheon that you might still get that $7 billion. We're talking about the special lease rental. You might still get it up front, but then it's redistributed after 3 to 4 years to the other states. And WA then endures the inevitable downturn in employment that the tax imposes. And we've had not one explanation as to why that's any different for the gold sector. And it's not. We've heard today that 60% of it from the under-treasurer, 60% of it gets distributed away. And yet it's a sector that actually can't afford it. BHP made $5.9 billion last financial year. WA accounted for 40% of that revenue. Rio Tinto made $3.9 billion for the first 6 months to June 30, $3.2 billion of which came from the Pilbara. That's US dollars. Yet this government has let them off the hook instead of targeting the likes. Instead, they've targeted the likes of Northern Star Resources and other gold mining companies. Labor have proven with this budget that election promises mean nothing unless they are made to BHP and Rio Tinto. So, Mr Speaker, we've already announced today that the Nationals will not vote. I will clarify that we're not going to vote against the appropriation bills. We are not wreckers, as the opposite side has said, but when the regulations come to Parliament, or the acts that need to be amended in relation to the payroll tax come to this Parliament, the Nationals will use the tools that we have at our disposal to oppose those measures. We've had a long-standing position on the gold royalty tax, and we will not be supporting that. We do not agree with an increase to the gold royalty tax. We certainly do not agree with an increase in payroll tax. We understand the pressure that the gold sector is under, and the pressures that come to bear in relation to those thin margins and their ability to invest in exploration to continue to grow that sector. And we will stand shoulder to shoulder with them. Unlike Labor, who dumped them like a hot potato as soon as they got to government, it was very convenient. And we will not support a tax on jobs. We will help the government fulfil its election commitment to create more jobs by opposing a tax on jobs, and that is the position of the Nationals. Mr Speaker, the Labor Party, Mr Acting Speaker, the Labor Party has a choice to make. And what I started to say at the beginning of this contribution is that we think they've made the wrong choices. The other choice they could make is to cut back on some of those election commitments. They've shown they're prepared to break their election commitments, and so they could actually cut back on Metronet. But they're not going to do that because the Minister for Transport quite likes standing in front of shiny new stations and getting the shovel out and sticking it in. That's what she likes doing. I think, Mr Acting Speaker, that she's trying to outdo the member in the other place who built the Mandurah to Perth railway line. I think that's what it is. There's a little bit of competition to see who can outdo it, and that will come at the cost of thousands of jobs and royalties for regions and businesses being asked to pay more for these vanity projects. So there's no restraint from Labor. There's no restraint from Labor. There's no restraint from Labor on spending. There's no restraint from Labor on these projects, on these spending. So they have choices. They have choices to make, Mr Acting Speaker. They have choices to make, because you cannot come to this place on one hand and say, Mr Acting Speaker, that we must tighten our belts and that we are going to break all of our promises to the organisations that helped to get them here, to the mums and dads that voted for them on the promise of we will look after you, on the promise that we will look after you, and then the moment you get to government, you say, oof, can't afford that. Can't afford that, but we're not going to break our promises on our election commitments because we need to make sure that Metro debt is delivered. And that's what that is. And so you have raided royalties for regions, you have increased payroll tax. The Labor Party has hit the gold sector, for some reason unwilling to walk anywhere near the offices of BHP and Rio Tinto. $7 billion. There's a revenue stream right there waiting to be negotiated, but apparently that's not something that this Treasurer or this Premier is willing to go down that path. So we say that they are making the wrong choices, and that they are choices that will cost jobs, that will cause pain for households, and businesses won't change a thing when it comes to reducing debt. And their priorities are wrong. They came to government without a financial plan. And I do want to talk about the fact that there are some seriously wrong priorities in there. We talk about these big levers that the government has to pull on. As the member for Central Wheatbelt, I have had some discussions in my electorate, and it goes further than just my electorate. But one of the things that's been cut from royalties for regions is a fund that supported a multitude of small childcare centres right throughout the electorate. Now, the way that the funding model is set up from Canberra never ever works for our small community centres in regional Western Australia. We simply don't have the numbers. So if you're in Muckambuddin, if you're in Training, if you're in Katanning, these are not centres that will ever get to critical mass in terms of numbers to make that commercial model work. And they are run by volunteer mums who want to be able to participate in the workforce, who want to be able to contribute to their communities, and they are very hard to make work. And we had a funding stream there to support them to make sure that they were sustainable and allow them to innovate, and we were working on a project that would actually put them on a pathway to sustainability, particularly in the wheat belt, and that's gone. That's gone. So no commitment to the mums and dads in regional Western Australia. That's all disappeared. And that is very, very disappointing, because I've had mums and carers and dads crying in relation to the pressures they feel in trying to keep these services open for their communities, Mr Acting Speaker. The community resource centres, I heard Lee Steele calling in from Pingelly this morning, they have had all of their worst fears confirmed. There's apparently a review underway within the Department of Regional Development, but again, a little bit like the review that the regional airlines inquiry is underway. Apparently the decision's already been made, so it's just something to give a backbencher something to do in the interim period. They all know that there will be no funding, so there will be cuts. Those community resource centres will disappear unless this government has a change of heart and decides to cut some of their own priority projects, like the $7 million pool that no one wants, or the Bunbury entry statement, which I can't for the life of me, even in the context of the Minister for Regional Development's comments around petunias, how do you make that? How do you make that decision in the current context when you're arguing that everyone has to tighten their belt? It's just, it beggars belief. The other major project in the wheat belt and Great Southern, Mr Acting Speaker, is the cuts, the real cuts to projects for aged care. Now we're talking about independent living units, $43 million worth of investment to create housing to allow us to assist in attracting and retaining those people that have made an amazing contribution to building our communities. And at a point in time when they are unable, when they require additional care and they need to downsize or stay in their community but are unable to at the moment because there isn't the appropriate housing, there isn't the appropriate health facilities. These independent living unit projects, these aged care projects, these hostel projects were designed to ensure that we could look after those that have contributed so much. It's also about creating jobs. It's also about creating jobs. One of the planks of the Wheat Belt Development Commission's regional investment blueprint was that aged care sector was a growth sector in terms of jobs and employment for the wheat belt. But that's all gone. Pulled that out. We had $43 million. We've got now, they are now scrabbling over $20 million, and you can't make that work. They were projects that were already committed, but we're getting a multi-storey car park in Mandurah, so it's okay. It's okay. And the final one before I finish up, Mr Acting Speaker, is the fact that we are so incredibly disappointed that despite all the rhetoric in relation to agriculture, this state government and the Minister for Agriculture, in amongst all of the plethora of media statements that have been pumped out since the last Thursday where the budget was brought down, 50 or more, not one in relation to agriculture. There's nothing, nada. So clearly when you don't have anything good to say, you don't say it. And that's what everyone in the ag sector has figured out. Very, very disappointing, very disappointing. So all we've got out of this budget is broken promises and more debt. We say that the Labor Party has some choices to make, and we certainly will not be assisting them in relation to the gold royalty or the payroll tax. We think they are the wrong choices. They can make some decisions about spending in relation to Metronet and restoring some of the faith with the regional Western Australian communities that are feeling the brunt of the decision to raid royalties for regions. Shame on all those members from regional Western Australia that stood up and applauded. You have nothing to be proud of in this budget, and your electorates will judge you. Your electorates will judge you accordingly.